Golden silence. On Sycamore Lane. The first light of morning settled gently over the rooftops of Oak Creek, Virginia, a quiet suburb cradled by the outer curves of the Shenandoah Hills. It was early autumn, and the maples lining Sycamore Lane had begun their annual transformation. Brilliant gold and russet leaves clung loosely to branches, rustling softly in the dawn breeze before drifting down to the cracked sidewalks below. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth, and the world moved with the unhurried rhythm that seemed baked into the bones of the town. In this tranquil rhythm, the people of Oak Creek found comfort. Dog walkers offered one another the same half-nods each morning. Porch swings creaked. Coffee steamed in weathered mugs held by retirees who knew each day would unfold like the last. Among them was Arthur Peterson, who could always be found just after sunrise on the porch of his modest, ivy-covered brick home. A cup of black coffee in hand, and the crossword puzzle laid out on the small wooden table beside him. Arthur was 72, with neatly combed silver hair and the slow, deliberate movements of a man who measured his steps. He wore the same tan cardigan most mornings, no matter the weather, and always walked with a handsome oak cane, a gift from his late wife, Eleanor. Since her passing 5 years ago, the cane had become more than a necessity. It was an anchor to memory, to routine. That morning, as the fog clung low to the lawns and birds chirped tentatively from the telephone wires, Arthur noticed something unusual, a flicker of movement at the edge of the street. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. It wasn't a squirrel or chipmunk. No, their movements were too erratic. This was slower, smoother, like a ribbon of shadow unfurling just beyond his hydrangea bushes. He stood with effort and descended the 3 front steps of his porch, following the movement as it paused near the curb beneath the dappled shade of a sugar maple. There, sitting with calm that seemed out of place in such a small creature, was a kitten. But not the kind meant for laps or litter boxes. Its coat was a mixture of tawny gold and shadowed gray, rosetted faintly with darker spots. Its paws were broad, almost too big for its frame, and its stubby tail flicked with idle disinterest. Most telling of all were the black tufted ears, sharp, expressive, and alert. A bobcat. Young, likely no older than a few months, no bigger than a football, but unmistakably wild. Arthur's heart quickened, not from fear, but from something closer to reverence. He'd lived in Oak Creek for 4 decades, and in all that time, he'd only seen adult bobcats as blurred shapes at the edge of the tree line at dusk. This was different. This was out of place. He expected it to run, to vanish into the safety of the woods like a breath held too long. But the kitten didn't run. Instead, it turned to look at him, directly, unflinchingly. Its eyes were pale amber, rimmed with a startling intelligence. And then it chirped. The sound was brief and bird-like, almost comical coming from a predator. Yet it rang out clear and deliberate in the quiet street. The kitten took one tentative step toward him, then another. It stopped a few feet away and sat back on its haunches, observing him in complete silence. Arthur didn't move. He was afraid to break whatever fragile spell had been cast between them. The kitten's ears swiveled slightly as a car door shut somewhere down the street, but it didn't flinch. It just watched him, curious and calm. And then, just as suddenly, it stood and turned, padding toward the neighboring yard. It squeezed through the bottom of Mrs. Gable's fence and vanished into her azalea bushes. Arthur remained rooted to the sidewalk. The silence that followed was different than before. Not just the absence of sound, but the residue of something unseen. He glanced toward the woods. dense, brooding, and only 100 yards away, and then back to the shrubs where the kitten had disappeared. Nothing stirred. That night, he told himself it had been a fluke, a rare, strange encounter. But the next morning, as the mist lifted from the lawns, the kitten was back. Sitting on the curb like a little prince, batting at a leaf. Arthur approached slowly, careful not to startle it. Once again, the kitten chirped and blinked at him, utterly at ease. "You're a long way from home, little fellow," he murmured. The kitten made no reply, only tilted its head before pouncing on the leaf again, its stubby tail twitching. And just like that, Rusty had arrived. It was the Johnson kids, 10-year-old Eli and 7-year-old Nora, who named him. "Rusty," they called him from their porch, noting the coppery sheen in his fur. And soon enough, the name stuck. Neighbors began leaving bowls of water. A few offered scraps of meat after seeing Rusty expertly dispatch a field mouse. Cars slowed as drivers snapped photos through open windows. The wild kitten had become a fixture on Sycamore Lane, as much a part of the scenery as the red mailbox or the leaning maple tree. But Arthur watched more closely than most. He noticed that Rusty never seemed to stay long in one place. That his eyes, always scanning, never quite rested. That his belly, despite the generous handouts, was growing leaner. And he couldn't shake the question that had lodged itself into the corners of his mind. Where was the mother? The retiree who watched closely. Arthur Peterson hadn't meant to become the bobcat's quiet guardian. It simply happened, the way leaves collect in corners without anyone noticing, until one day there's a pile. Each morning, after coffee and crossword, he found himself standing near the edge of his lawn, eyes scanning the street for that telltale flicker of motion or the delicate chirp that had once startled him and now had become something he waited for. Rusty arrived like clockwork, emerging from the same stretch of tangled underbrush just before 9, sometimes trotting across lawns, sometimes slipping silently beneath porch steps. There was a lightness to the way he moved, more like wind than muscle. But beneath that kitten charm, Arthur saw something else. A tension in the shoulders, a pause too long at sudden sounds, a way of looking at everything as if calculating 1,000 possibilities. And it gnawed at him. He tried not to interfere. Nature was nature. Still, each time he watched the kitten gulp down a torn scrap of chicken or a crust of bread, Arthur's mind reeled with questions. Was this wild behavior? Or had hunger carved something unnatural into Rusty's instincts? Why was he alone? And why did he come not just once, but every single day? A week passed, then 2, and every time Rusty returned. Other neighbors, charmed by the novelty, had begun leaving treats deliberately. A bowl of milk on the Mackenzies' front porch. Rotisserie chicken leftovers beside the street lamp near the intersection. Even Mrs. Gable, whose nerves had once been rattled by the kitten's choice to lounge in her prized azaleas, now left tuna in a china dish, muttering to herself about the poor dear. Arthur watched all of it from his porch, not with delight, but unease. Rusty wasn't thriving, that was clear. Though playful in bursts, the kitten's gait had begun to falter. His ribs now showed faintly beneath the fur. And his coat, once bright with a silky sheen, had grown dull. His eyes, too, had changed. No longer wide with wonder, they were sharp with something else. Determination, maybe, fear masked by habit. Arthur began keeping a small notepad on the porch table, jotting times, locations, and sightings. He didn't tell anyone. It felt foolish, perhaps, but it grounded him, and it reminded him of Eleanor. His late wife had always noticed the things others missed: a mole on a robin's wing, the subtle difference between a fake laugh and a real one. She'd been a school teacher, known for her fairness, her calm voice, her habit of tucking a pencil behind one ear even when she wasn't grading papers. Eleanor would have understood this strange, silent watching. She would have known that Arthur wasn't just looking for answers about a bobcat. He was looking for something he didn't yet have words for. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Rusty first appeared, Arthur was in his usual place when something shifted. Mr. Henderson, a cheerful man in his 60s who delivered fresh eggs from his backyard hens every Saturday, had pulled over at the curb. Arthur saw him lean out of his car window and toss a piece of granola bar to Rusty, who was seated on the sidewalk. The kitten didn't eat it. Instead, Rusty looked around, head jerking in quick motions, and then, with the granola piece clenched in his teeth, took off. Not toward the woods. Not back the way he came, but down the street, toward the end of Sycamore Lane, the opposite direction. Arthur's breath caught. He rose, steadied himself with the cane, and made his way down the porch steps, moving faster than he had in years. His heart thudded not from exertion, but from clarity. For weeks he'd been circling a truth he couldn't name. Now, at last, it stepped into light. Rusty wasn't just eating. He was collecting. The old engineer in Arthur kicked in. Systems, patterns, logic. Why would a bobcat take food and not eat it, unless it wasn't for him? Arthur returned to the house, quickly changing from his house slippers into walking shoes. He grabbed his cane, slipped a pair of binoculars around his neck, more for bird-watching than spying, but they'd do, and headed down the street. He kept to the far side of the road, using trees and parked cars for cover, careful not to startle the kitten or alert any neighbors who might find his behavior curious. From a distance, he could see Rusty, darting with intention, his small body hugging the shadows. At the very end of Sycamore Lane, where manicured lawns gave way to a scruffy plot of municipal land, tangled brush, thorny vines, forgotten trash. Rusty slipped through a narrow gap in the fence. Arthur hesitated at the edge, glancing around before ducking under the sagging wire. The land on the other side was dense with tall grasses and clusters of Virginia creeper. It smelled of damp earth and rust. He moved slowly, placing each foot carefully, the old cane probing the ground ahead. Then he saw it. A large iron storm drain, set low into a slope, half hidden by vines and brush. The grate was rusted and thick, its edges swallowed by years of growth. Rusty stood near it. He paused only a moment, then disappeared behind a curtain of weeds. Arthur crept closer, heart pounding in his chest. A few seconds passed. Then Rusty reappeared. No food in his mouth now. He licked one paw, then another, and turned his head sharply. Their eyes met across the clearing. No chirp, no greeting, just a long, unreadable stare. Then Rusty vanished again, slipping back into the vines, his body melting into the green. Arthur didn't follow. Not yet. But he knew. Somehow, in his marrow, he understood. The kitten was not just surviving, he was supplying. Someone or something was waiting on the other side of that drain. And tomorrow, Arthur would be ready to find out what. A wild child with nowhere to go. Arthur hardly slept that night. The vision of Rusty disappearing into the storm drain replayed behind his eyes again and again. The way the kitten moved, quick and practiced, like someone who had done it dozens of times. Not the playful meandering of a curious wild animal, but the urgent gait of a messenger, a provider. The granola bar clenched in his tiny jaws hadn't been a snack. It had been cargo. Arthur lay awake in bed, the shadows of the ceiling fans spinning across the room like slow-turning thoughts. He rose before dawn, brewed coffee he didn't drink, and sat in his porch chair, listening to the wind rustle through the oaks lining Sycamore Lane. By late morning, he'd packed a canvas bag with a flashlight, gloves, a bottle of water, and something new: boiled chicken breast, shredded and carefully sealed in a plastic container. No salt, no seasoning. He'd cooked it himself. When Rusty appeared that day, Arthur didn't greet him. He watched. The kitten sniffed the air, hesitated, then padded up to the chicken Arthur had placed on the grass. He devoured half with desperate energy. Then, just as Arthur predicted, gathered the rest in his mouth and trotted down the lane. Arthur followed, carefully as before. At the clearing, he waited long enough to be sure Rusty was inside before approaching the storm drain. It was worse than he'd expected. The grate was rusted through, bolted into a concrete frame, its heavy iron bars lined with spider webs and debris. But on the right side, just where the concrete met the soil, erosion had carved a small pocket, an animal-sized passage obscured by vines and weeds. Arthur pulled on his gloves and knelt, his knees creaking in protest. Lying on his stomach, he pushed back the thick curtain of Virginia creeper and peered into the darkness beyond the grate. The smell hit him first. Damp, moldy air thick with the scent of rot and rust. He clicked on his flashlight, its narrow beam cutting a path through the gloom. At first, there was nothing. Just a discarded soda can, an old potato chip bag, a scattering of leaves. Then he swept the beam further, deeper, and his heart stopped. There, 15 feet back in the wide tunnel, was a nest, if you could call it that. A crude bed of grass and dried debris tucked into a dry alcove, and in it lay an adult bobcat. She was emaciated, her fur filthy and matted with mud. Her ribs stood out starkly beneath her pelt. One of her hind legs was grotesquely twisted, the swelling visible even in the dim light. Her eyes, golden and glassy, reflected the beam but didn't flinch. She didn't growl, didn't move. She was too weak. Then Arthur saw them. Two tiny shapes wriggling weakly against her belly, kittens, barely more than newborns, eyes half open, their mews so faint he could barely hear them. His breath caught in his throat. And then, Rusty reappeared. He trotted into the beam of light, still carrying the chicken. He approached his mother, dropped the food gently near her nose, and began to nuzzle her face, chirping softly. The sound echoed in the tunnel, small and broken. Arthur pressed a hand to his chest, trying to quiet the sudden storm there. This was why Rusty had come to them, why he risked sidewalks and cars and strangers, not for his own survival, but for theirs. He was a kitten, no more than 5 or 6 months old. Yet here he was, feeding a dying mother and 2 siblings too small to fend for themselves. A child playing the role of a parent in a world that had turned brutal far too early. Arthur backed away slowly, crawling out from the brush and brushing dirt from his knees. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of wet leaves and something more ancient, fear, maybe, or awe. Back home, he didn't bother with lunch or his crossword. He moved on instinct, phone in hand, flipping through contacts until he found the number he'd saved weeks ago, on a hunch he'd never imagined he'd use. It rang twice. Willow Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. This is Dr. Evans. Arthur's voice shook as he introduced himself, but his words were steady. He told her everything: the bobcat kitten, the storm drain, the injured mother, the 2 younger kittens. Dr. Evans asked sharp, focused questions. How big was the drain? How far back did the nest sit? Was the mother conscious? Yes, Arthur replied. She looked at me, but she couldn't move. You did the right thing calling us, she said, and the right thing by not trying to intervene yourself. Can you stay nearby and guide us in without disturbing them? I'm not going anywhere, Arthur said, his voice firmer than it had been in years. 30 minutes passed like an eternity. Rusty never emerged. The clearing remained still, except for the gentle sway of tall grasses. Then, from the road above, a white van pulled up quietly. On its side, the green and gold logo of Willow Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. Two people stepped out, a woman in her 40s with keen, perceptive eyes, and a younger man with a soft-spoken manner and strong arms that moved with practiced calm. Mr. Peterson? The woman asked, crossing to him with a nod. I'm Dr. Evans. This is Ben. Arthur nodded, gesturing toward the overgrown path. It's this way, I'll show you. Together, they made their way through the brush. As they reached the storm drain, Dr. Evans dropped to her knees, shining a tactical flashlight through the iron grate. I see them, she murmured. Arthur watched her face, saw the change in her expression, saw the same thing he'd felt, heartbreak and urgency folded into quiet resolve. Ben moved quickly, preparing sedatives and carriers. They wouldn't try to reach the animals through Rusty's narrow passage. Instead, they would pry up the grate itself, just enough to create a safe opening. As they worked, Dr. Evans turned to Arthur. There's a lot that could go wrong, she said quietly, but we'll try. We'll do everything we can. Arthur nodded, and something in his chest, something long dormant, began to stir. One clue changes everything. The sedative worked faster than expected. Through the dim beam of Dr. Evans's flashlight, Arthur watched as the mother bobcat's breathing slowed, her head sinking onto the nest of dried leaves. There was no resistance, no last surge of fear or fight, just a slow, heavy surrender. The two smaller kittens stirred beside her, blind to the flurry of movement preparing to lift them from the only world they'd known. It's done, Dr. Evans said softly, withdrawing the jab stick and nodding to Ben. Ben braced himself and carefully wedged the crowbar beneath one corner of the heavy iron grate. With a groan of rusted metal, it lifted just enough to create a narrow opening. He held it steady as Dr. Evans lay down and reached in with gloved hands, first cradling the mother's thin, limp body, then gently sliding her out into the fading daylight. Even sedated, her condition was gut-wrenching up close. Her coat was patchy and caked with grime. Her breathing came in slow, pained wheezes. One leg was swollen to twice its normal size, twisted at the knee, the fur split in places to reveal infected skin. And yet, even now, she held a strange dignity, her ears still alert, her face still unmistakably fierce. They laid her inside a ventilated transport carrier padded with blankets. Okay, Dr. Evans murmured. Let's get the little ones. Ben crouched low, slid his shoulders through the opening, and disappeared into the storm drain. Arthur stood just a few feet away, his hand unconsciously tightening around the curve of his cane. Minutes passed. Then a voice echoed up from the tunnel, reverent and low. They're tiny, barely hanging on. Ben emerged, cradling the two kittens against his chest. He passed them one by one to Dr. Evans, who wrapped them in fleece blankets and placed them into a heated carrier prepared in the back of the van. Their eyes were barely open, their heads bobbing weakly. One mewed, a paper-thin sound that made Arthur swallow hard. Rusty hadn't come out. Arthur pointed toward the edge of the woods. "He's out there, hiding." Dr. Evans followed his gaze, then opened another small trap cage. She knelt and baited it with the rest of the boiled chicken Arthur had brought that morning. "He knows the smell," she said, "and he'll want to be with them. With any luck, he'll come." Ben packed up the gear while Dr. Evans sat beside the carriers, making quiet notes on a clipboard. Arthur hovered, uncertain of what to do with his hands. He kept glancing toward the trees, the clearing, the crumpled shadow of the storm drain still hidden behind vines. They loaded the mother and the kittens into the van. Dr. Evans turned back to Arthur. "We'll do everything we can. Her leg's a bad break, compound fracture, and the infection is advanced. But she's still fighting, and Rusty." She trailed off, then looked directly at him. "He saved them, Mr. Peterson. That kitten is the only reason they're still alive." Arthur's voice was thick. "What happens now? If we can save her leg, we'll rehabilitate all of them together. Our goal is always to return them to the wild, if possible as a family unit. If not, to a protected preserve far from humans. Somewhere they can live as they were meant to." She handed him a card. "Call me in a few days. I'll let you know." The van door closed with a soft finality, and just like that, they were gone. Arthur stood in the clearing long after they'd disappeared up the access road. The breeze stirred the grass. A distant crow called from somewhere in the trees, and in that stillness, he waited. The sun had just begun to dip, long golden shadows stretching across the dirt, when he saw it. Rusty. He emerged from the underbrush on trembling legs, his nose twitching, his body low to the ground. He looked around the clearing, expecting, perhaps, the scent of his family or the soft murmur of his mother's breath. He called once, a short, questioning chirp. Then, catching the scent of the chicken, he padded toward the trap. He paused at the entrance, his body tight with hesitation, and glanced once over his shoulder toward the woods. Then, slowly, he stepped inside. The trap door clicked shut behind him. Arthur crossed the clearing, his throat tight, his knees aching with every step. He peered through the mesh. Rusty didn't struggle. He didn't even flinch. He simply curled himself into the straw lining, wrapped his thin body around the food, and exhaled, his small shoulders sinking, his sides rising in soft, steady rhythm. Arthur pulled out his phone. "I have him," he said when Dr. Evans answered. 2 days later, Arthur made the call again. This time his hands trembled as he dialed. Dr. Evans answered on the first ring. "Arthur, I was hoping you'd call." Her voice held a warmth he hadn't realized he'd been missing. "We had to amputate the mother's leg," she said gently. "The infection was too advanced to save it. But she's a fighter. She's already eating. Her spirit is strong, and bobcats are remarkably resilient. They can hunt on 3 legs. They adapt." Arthur felt something bloom in his chest, equal parts pain and relief. "And the kittens?" he asked. "The 2 little ones are still touch and go, but they're feeding, growing stronger every hour." "And Rusty?" She laughed quietly. "He's a marvel." The moment he saw her, his mother, he ran to her. He hasn't left her side. He's not just recovering, he's helping them heal. He keeps them warm, grooms them, even brings his toys, if you can believe it. Arthur blinked fast against the pressure behind his eyes. "You saved them too," she said softly. "You and that kitten." In the weeks that followed, Arthur visited the sanctuary. Quietly, without fanfare, he brought supplies, blankets, food, donations. Dr. Peterson Evans always welcomed him with a nod and a smile, and sometimes, if it was a good day, she let him stand at the observation window. He watched as the mother, whom they'd named Eleanor at his quiet request, healed and grew strong on 3 legs, as the 2 younger kittens wrestled and played, and as Rusty, finally unburdened, allowed himself to be a kitten again. One day, Eleanor looked up from her resting place and fixed Arthur with her wild, golden gaze. And he could have sworn she knew exactly who he was. The truth beneath the leaves. It was strange how quickly Rusty adjusted to safety. Within days of arriving at Willow Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, the hardened edge that had clung to his movements, the alertness, the suspicion, began to soften. Though still cautious, he no longer flinched at approaching footsteps. He ate more, slept more, and for the first time since Arthur had known him, purred. The change was subtle at first. A twitch of his ears, a slow blink when Dr. Evans entered the enclosure, the way he pressed his forehead against Eleanor's shoulder when he thought no one was watching. But the biggest transformation came from the absence of a burden. No longer responsible for scavenging food or watching over siblings barely able to move, Rusty began to behave more like what he was. A kitten, not a caretaker. He pounced on feathers tied to sticks, rolled on his back with clumsy enthusiasm, and curled himself tightly around his brother and sister when they slept, all with the easy contentment of a creature who had been given permission to rest. Eleanor, now 2 weeks past surgery, was healing. The stump where her leg had been was clean and bandaged, her fur slowly regaining its sheen. Despite the trauma she had endured, capture, injury, helplessness, she remained composed. When the staff entered her enclosure, she watched them with wary intelligence, but made no threatening moves. She tolerated their presence in silence, her golden eyes always tracking but never accusing. Arthur visited every Thursday. It wasn't planned, not at first, but soon it became a rhythm of its own. Just after noon, cane in hand, canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He brought small offerings, sardine treats, soft bedding, a warm thermos of coffee for Dr. Evans. Sometimes he simply sat on the wooden bench outside the enclosure, watching. He rarely spoke when he visited, but when he did, it was always to Rusty. "Look at you," he murmured once, as the young bobcat clambered onto a perch of smoothed logs, tail flicking with confidence. "King of the castle now." Rusty paused, tilting his head, his ears swiveling in Arthur's direction. Then he chirped, softly, once, and turned back toward his siblings. Eleanor lay nearby, her eyes half-lidded in the afternoon light, but as Rusty settled beside her, she lifted her head and blinked slowly at Arthur. And he blinked back. The sanctuary staff, led by Dr. Evans and her assistant Ben, worked with quiet efficiency. The kittens, named by the team, Fern for the smallest female and Clove for the inquisitive male, were gaining weight rapidly. They fed from bottles, then moved on to softened meat, their play becoming bolder, their voices stronger. But it was Rusty who intrigued them most. "I've never seen anything like it," Ben said one morning, watching as Rusty nudged Clove away from a tangled vine he was chewing. Then fetched a bit of rabbit meat and placed it near his younger brother's paws. "He's like a third parent." Dr. Evans nodded. "He had to grow up too fast. Now he's trying to unlearn that." "But he won't let go of them," Ben added. "No," she said quietly. "He won't." It was Arthur who asked the question everyone else avoided. One afternoon, as he sat with Dr. Evans near the enclosure, he spoke without turning his head. What happens if she doesn't make it? Dr. Sycamore. Evans didn't answer right away. The late sunlight cast long slats of gold across the gravel path between them. Inside the enclosure, Eleanor dozed while the kittens tangled themselves in a game of mock hunting. Rusty lay between them, his body still, his eyes watchful. "She's stable," Dr. Evans said finally. "The amputation went well. She's strong. But the real challenge isn't physical. It's whether she can teach them what she needs to. Whether they learn what they need to survive out there." Arthur nodded. "And if they don't?" "We find alternatives," she said gently. "Protected preserves, wildlife centers with expansive habitats. We won't split them if we can help it." Arthur exhaled slowly. "He won't go without them. That much I know." Dr. Evans turned to look at him, her voice quiet. "And you wouldn't either." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Weeks passed. Rusty grew. By mid-November, his kitten fluff had given way to the sleek, spotted coat of a juvenile bobcat. His muscles filled out, his gait steadier, less clumsy. And with every passing day, his bond with his family deepened. One morning, as Arthur arrived with his usual thermos and soft hello, he was met by a scene that brought him to a full stop. Eleanor had climbed, laboriously, carefully, to the upper platform of the enclosure. From her perch, she watched as Fern and Clove sparred below. But beside her, pressed against her side, Rusty lay with his chin resting across her shoulders, eyes half closed. He looked for the first time content. Dr. Evans joined him quietly. They've accepted each other fully now. It took time. Arthur nodded. He always loved her. That never changed. She smiled. And she finally had enough strength to love him back. The quiet bond between Arthur and Eleanor, the bobcat, not the wife he still missed every morning, was never spoken aloud. But it lived in shared glances, in the way she never flinched when he stood by the fence, even as others did, in the stillness that settled over her when he spoke to Rusty, as if she knew, as if she remembered. One Thursday, as the first hints of frost laced the grass, Arthur placed a photo frame on the bench beside him. Inside was a printed picture, taken from a still frame of the sanctuary's cameras. Eleanor curled around her 3 kittens, Rusty pressed to her side. Fern tucked beneath her foreleg, Clove peeking out with wide eyes. He positioned it beside a smaller silver frame he carried in his bag each week, the one with the woman in the summer dress. Her arm looped around his, both laughing at something just outside the camera's gaze. 2 mothers, 2 families, 2 pieces of his heart. Rusty chirped from the enclosure, tail flicking as he chased Fern across the leaf-strewn floor. Clove bounded after them, all paws and exuberance. And Eleanor? She lifted her head and blinked once, slowly, at Arthur. He smiled and whispered, "Good girl." The call that might save them. Winter came slowly to the Shenandoah foothills that year, creeping in with long blue shadows and early dusks. The leaves had all but fallen from the trees, carpeting the forest floor in a thick, muffling blanket. At Willow Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, the rhythm of care didn't change much. Feedings continued, medical checks remained steady. But there was a different kind of stillness now, one that belonged not to exhaustion, but to a kind of waiting. Rusty and his family had stabilized. Eleanor's wound had healed cleanly, and she moved through her enclosure with a newfound elegance, her 3-legged gait measured but confident. The younger kittens, Fern and Clove, had grown sturdy and bright-eyed, chasing each other up tree trunks and along low branches with an abandon that spoke of security. And Rusty, he remained the constant, their compass, their unshakable center. Dr. Evans was the first to suggest the possibility. "They're strong enough now," she said one morning, as she and Arthur stood by the outer fence, steaming coffee in hand. "We need to start preparing them for release." Arthur didn't answer at first. He watched as Fern batted at a pine cone while Clove launched himself from a log, missing by inches and tumbling into a pile of leaves. Rusty, lying above on a broad rock, simply twitched an ear and continued observing. "Do you think she's ready?" Arthur asked. "Eleanor?" Dr. Evans nodded. "Yes. She's moving beautifully, and bobcats are natural loners. Even in the wild, the maternal bond fades once the kittens are old enough." Arthur's jaw tightened. "But with these three, it feels different." "It is," she admitted. "But instinct doesn't vanish. It reasserts itself." He turned to her then, brows drawn. "You think Rusty will just walk away?" Dr. Evans exhaled slowly. "I think he'll do what's natural when the time comes. But it's up to us to make sure that time comes right. Safely." The sanctuary's team began a transition plan. They modified the enclosure, adding more wild stimuli, reducing human presence even further. Live prey simulations were introduced, food left in hidden crevices to encourage tracking and foraging. Eleanor was the first to adapt, returning to her predatory grace with surprising speed. She stalked low, crept silently, and pounced with deadly accuracy, though always with care, especially when Fern or Clove came bounding too close mid-hunt. Fern, ever the observer, mimicked her mother quickly. Clove took longer, distracted often by bugs or the allure of his own tail, but eventually, even he began to crouch in the shadows, pupils dilated with intent. And Rusty? He remained somewhere in the middle. Fierce and capable, yes, but sometimes reluctant, as though a part of him was always holding back. Arthur noticed it first during a feeding drill. The team had hidden pieces of quail throughout the enclosure, expecting the bobcats to fan out and hunt. Eleanor, Fern, and Clove took to it with ease. Rusty, however, didn't move until his siblings had eaten. Then, quietly, he crept to what was left, picked it up in his mouth, and placed it before Fern. Dr. Evans, watching from the observation room, made a note in her log. "Still the caretaker," she murmured. The next few weeks were critical. The sanctuary scheduled a veterinary checkup for Eleanor and the kittens. Vitals were taken, mobility assessed, reflexes tested. All signs pointed to one conclusion: the bobcats were ready for release. Dr. Evans filed the paperwork with the State Wildlife Department, securing a location deep within Shenandoah National Park, remote, protected, and full of prey and cover. It was, in her words, as close to wild paradise as we can find. Arthur received the news over the phone. "They're ready," she said simply. He didn't speak for a long time. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "Yes." "And him?" There was a pause. "That's the only part I can't predict. But I think he knows. He's been watching her. He's learning. And he's still a bobcat." Arthur hung up and sat in silence, the house around him creaking softly in the cold. The photo on the mantel stared back. Eleanor, his Eleanor, frozen in that summer laugh, her arm looped through his, and beside it, the new frame. Rusty curled against his mother. Fern sprawled over Clove like a warm blanket. Two families. The next morning was sharp and cold, frost crisping the grass and edging every branch in silver. Arthur arrived at the sanctuary early, greeted by Ben at the gate. "They're all loaded," Ben said, gesturing toward the van. "Dr. Evans is inside making final checks." Arthur walked around the vehicle slowly. The three carriers were side by side in the back, covered with thermal blankets. He leaned toward Rusty's crate. The kitten, now nearly grown, lifted his head. Their eyes met. "You did good," Arthur whispered. "You did more than anyone ever should have asked." Rusty blinked once, slow and deliberate. Dr. Evans emerged, clipboard in hand. "We'll be releasing them at first light tomorrow," she said. "Want to come?" Arthur hesitated, then nodded. "I think I need to." The next day, just after dawn, they arrived at a ridge deep within Shenandoah. The air was clear and cold, filled with birdsong and the far-off call of ravens. Before them stretched a vast valley, untouched and wild, mist curling along the treetops like breath. Ben and Dr. Evans moved with practiced calm, placing the carriers in a line and gently unbolting the doors. Arthur stood a few steps back, hands curled over the handle of his cane. Eleanor was the first to emerge. She stepped cautiously into the light, sniffed the wind, and paused. Then she moved forward, slow at first, then with increasing confidence, disappearing into the underbrush without a sound. Next came Fern and Clove, bursting from their crates like coiled springs. They vanished in opposite directions, then circled back, chirped once to each other, and followed their mother into the trees. Only one crate remained closed. Rusty sat inside, still. Arthur approached, slowly. Dr. Evans placed a hand on the latch. "Would you like to?" Arthur nodded, his fingers trembling as he lifted the catch. The door swung open with a soft, metallic sigh. Rusty stepped forward, placed one paw on the threshold, and stopped. He turned, and for a long, breathless moment, he stared straight at Arthur. The world around them fell quiet. Even the trees seemed to still. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a goodbye. It was something deeper. A recognition. Then Rusty blinked, turned, and with a flick of his short tail, slipped into the woods. Arthur exhaled. His shoulders, which had held the weight of so many weeks, lowered. Dr. Evans stepped beside him. "They're free." Arthur nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "They are." Rusty's last journey alone. In the weeks after the release, Arthur's house settled into a new kind of quiet. It wasn't the oppressive silence of grief, the kind that had clung to him after Eleanor passed, filling the corners of rooms and the pauses in conversation with absence. No, this was something gentler, a quiet that echoed with presence instead of loss. Like the forest after snowfall, emptied, yes, but never empty. He kept both photographs on the mantel. Eleanor, smiling in the breeze of a long-forgotten spring picnic. And Eleanor the bobcat, curled protectively around her three kittens, Rusty prominent among them, gazing at the camera with that same disquieting intelligence he'd shown from the start. Still, there were days Arthur found himself listening at the porch rail, half expecting the sound of paws padding along the sidewalk. On his walks, he sometimes slowed near Mrs. Gable's yard, remembering the flattened azalea bushes and the flick of a tufted tail. Even now, he kept a mental eye on the spot near the storm drain, though the grate had since been sealed and cleaned. They were gone. That was the truth, but the story, he knew, was far from over. One afternoon, close to Christmas, Dr. Evans called. "We have a situation," she said. Arthur's heart stumbled. "The family?" "Just Rusty," she said. "We've received reports. A young bobcat has been spotted near a residential edge of the park, close to trailheads and cabins. It's not confirmed, but the descriptions match." Arthur sat down. "He's left the others?" "That's the thing," she continued. "Eleanor and the other two are still deep within the territory we released them into. GPS tags confirm it. They're hunting, thriving, avoiding roads. Rusty, he's different. He's ranged far. Is he in danger? Not yet. But if he's showing up near people, too close for too long, it won't go well. We both know that. Arthur nodded. What do you need? We're heading up tomorrow, just a few of us. We want to see if we can find him and observe his behavior. See if this is a pattern or just a phase. She paused, then added, I thought you might want to come. Arthur didn't hesitate. Yes. The drive to Shenandoah was long and cold. The roads rhymed with early snow. Dr. Evans picked him up just after dawn, and they rode in silence for much of the way, the van's heater whirring and fogging the windows as the mountain ranges loomed closer. They reached the ranger station by midday. This is the report, Dr. Evans explained, unrolling a map across the dashboard. 3 sightings, here near the eastern trails, and here by the old service road, all within a quarter-mile radius. Alone? Arthur asked. Yes, always. They hiked in with Ranger Holt, a seasoned field biologist with a thick beard and a quieter demeanor than even Arthur's. Snow crunched underfoot. The sun was low, casting long blue shadows between the trees. It wasn't long before they found the tracks, compact, rounded prints moving across a frozen game trail. Bobcat. The gait was light, but unmistakable. He's not hiding, Holt murmured. He's passing through, searching. For food? Arthur asked. Holt hesitated. Maybe, but look. His trail doubles back here. Then again here. He's pacing, not hunting, looking for something else. They followed the trail until the light began to fade, then set up a motion-triggered camera near a patch of old stumps, a place bobcats often paused to scent mark or scan their surroundings. A few scraps of meat were left nearby, not bait exactly, but enough to warrant a pause. They returned early the next morning to check the camera. Rusty had been there. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A lean, spotted figure, padding silently through the snow, sniffing the air. He paused near the stump, glanced directly toward the camera as if he knew, then turned slowly and vanished into the trees. He doesn't look scared, Dr. Evans said, or injured. But he's not with them, Arthur added. No. They followed his path deeper that day. For hours they trekked, across ridges, along frozen creeks, over deer paths. Rusty's prints wove in and out, sometimes circling, sometimes meandering. And then, as the afternoon sun dipped low, they found what they hadn't expected. A hollow, sheltered, hidden between 2 crumbling boulders. Inside, flattened grass, a dusting of bobcat fur, a nest, a solitary one. Dr. Evans knelt, careful not to disturb the space. She studied it silently, then looked up at Arthur. He's living here, alone. Arthur's voice caught. Why? Dr. Evans hesitated. It's not uncommon for young males to strike out early, claim space, avoid confrontation. It could be instinct. But what if it's not? Arthur asked quietly. What if he doesn't know how to belong? She met his gaze. You mean, what if the time he spent caring for them? What if it changed him? Yes, Arthur said. What if he doesn't know how to stop? That night, back at the ranger station, they reviewed the footage again. Rusty's eyes stared back through the grainy image, not wild and fearful, but aware, present. He's not lost, Dr. Evans said. But he might be waiting. For what? Holt asked. Arthur looked out the window toward the dark silhouette of trees in the distance. For permission, he said. The next day, Dr. Evans made a choice. We're going to let him be, she told Arthur. He's healthy. He's cautious. And maybe this is his choice. Some bobcats range, some stay near family. Rusty's path doesn't have to look like theirs. Arthur nodded, though the ache in his chest had no words. But just before they left, Arthur walked alone into the edge of the woods near the last sighting. He stood quietly for a long time. Then softly he spoke. "You did everything right," he said to the trees. "You don't have to carry them anymore. They're safe now. And you can be too." There was no sound in reply, but somewhere out there, in the rustle of wind through frozen branches, something shifted, and Arthur turned back toward the trail, leaving behind only his footprints. Fading slowly beneath the falling snow, healing beside a fence line. Spring came to Shenandoah with quiet insistence. The snow melted from the ridgelines in slow rivulets, uncovering green shoots and damp earth. Red buds bloomed along the trails, splashing color onto the forest's still bare limbs. The air carried the scent of thawing leaves and new beginnings. At Willow Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, the thaw marked not just a seasonal change, but a shift in energy. The staff walked lighter. The enclosures, once dulled by winter's hush, now echoed with birdsong, the rustling of awakening animals, and the occasional chirp of 3 growing bobcats who had, against every odd, survived. Eleanor's fur had filled out once more, its mottled brown and silver thick with health. Her balance on 3 legs was no longer cautious. It was graceful. When she moved, it was with the same quiet authority Arthur had first seen in her storm-drained prison. But now it was unburdened by pain. Fern and Clove had grown tall and lean. Their baby blue eyes had shifted to gold, and their playful games had become more structured, more deliberate. They stalked shadows, chased insects with lightning reflexes, and sparred in bursts that blurred into flurries of fur and noise. They were wild again. But it was Rusty who drew the most attention. He had returned, not to the sanctuary itself. No one had tried to capture him. But one morning, about a month after Arthur's trip to Shenandoah, Dr. Evans spotted a familiar shape near the edge of the external fence line. A young bobcat, broader in the chest than before, with the same soft, reddish hue to his coat. He didn't come close. He didn't try to enter. He just sat there, watching. Dr. Evans called Arthur that day. "I think he wants to see them, or maybe just know they're all right." Arthur arrived the next morning, wrapped in his gray wool coat and carrying a thermos of tea. He walked the perimeter trail slowly, scanning the woods beyond the wire. At the north side of the enclosure, where the trees dipped low into a shallow ravine, he found him. Rusty. Sitting like a statue on a mossy rock, his body still but alert, his eyes fixed not on Arthur, but on the fence. Inside, Clove was pacing along the inner edge. Fern followed a few paces behind. Neither made a sound, but as Arthur stepped closer, the bobcats moved in unison. Rusty stood. Clove stopped. There was a beat of pure, humming stillness. Then Clove chirped. Rusty didn't respond immediately. He blinked once, slow. Then he turned, walked a wide circle just beyond the fence line, and paused near a gap where the wire sloped low with the terrain. He sat. Dr. Evans appeared beside Arthur. "It's not uncommon," she said softly. "Siblings returning to check on each other. But it feels intentional." Over the next few days, Rusty returned like clockwork, always in the morning, always staying just beyond reach. He never pressed against the fence, never begged or pawed or called out. He simply watched, and the others, especially Fern, watched back. Arthur visited more often, Not every day, but enough that Rusty began to expect him. Once, the young bobcat even approached within 15 feet, close enough for Arthur to see the faint scar along his shoulder from a briar scratch long healed. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. "He's checking in," Arthur said one afternoon. "Like he used to." "Checking in on who?" Dr. Evans asked. Arthur looked at her. "Everyone." That spring, the sanctuary made a rare decision. They opened the outer buffer gate, not the enclosure itself, but a neutral space between the fence lines. The hope was to allow Rusty closer contact with his siblings under supervision, without full re-entry into a human-managed environment. The first time they did it, Rusty didn't come. The second time, he circled but kept his distance. But the third time, Arthur was there when it happened. Rusty approached slowly, slipping through the trees like a shadow. Clove and Fern stood inside the enclosure, ears forward, eyes unblinking. Rusty reached the gate, paused, and looked to Arthur. It wasn't a question. It was an announcement. Then he stepped into the buffer zone. Inside the enclosure, the reaction was immediate. Clove bounded toward the fence, tail flicking, chirping like he had as a kitten. Fern was more cautious, but her ears remained upright, her gaze locked on Rusty. The three young bobcats paced along opposite sides of the barrier, mirroring one another. It was not the exuberant reunion Arthur had witnessed between Rusty and Eleanor all those months ago. This was quieter, older, but no less profound. Over the next weeks, Rusty returned regularly. Sometimes he stayed for just a few minutes, other times for an hour or more, sitting near the fence while Fern and Clove played or rested nearby. He never tried to enter, never lingered past sunset, and one day, he didn't come at all. Nor the next. A week passed, then two. The staff scanned the motion cameras regularly. There were no signs of injury, no distress calls from the other bobcats. Dr. Evans sighed as she stood beside Arthur one evening, arms crossed against the breeze. "He's moved on," she said. Arthur nodded. It was time. They stood together, watching Fern and Clove wrestling under the budding dogwood trees, their bodies sleek and strong. "He gave them the space to grow," Dr. Evans said, "and then he took it for himself." Arthur smiled, a soft pride curling at the corners of his mouth. That's what good brothers do. Later that evening, as the sun slipped below the tree line and the sanctuary turned gold, Arthur sat by the fence one last time. He didn't expect Rusty to return. He didn't need him to. The silence was full now, not with loss, but with a story that had come full circle. He reached into his bag and pulled out a new photo. It was taken by one of the trail cameras weeks earlier, Rusty in the wild, standing alone in a field of daffodils, backlit by the morning sun. Arthur tucked it into the second frame on his mantel. Then he went home. And for the first time in a long while, he slept without dreams, bound for the trees again. The call came on a bright, cool morning in early May. Arthur had just returned from his walk. His route now extended all the way past Sycamore Lane, out of habit more than necessity. When the phone rang, he recognized the number before he picked up. "Arthur," said Dr. Evans, her voice warm with quiet excitement. "They're ready." He didn't have to ask who. The release was scheduled for the following day. The weather forecast was favorable, mild temperatures, light wind, no chance of rain. The location chosen was a remote, elevated hollow deep within Shenandoah National Park, farther even than where Eleanor and her kittens had first been released. Dr. Evans explained that the team had waited until Fern and Clove were fully mature, their instincts sharp and their independence firmly established. And while Eleanor had long since acclimated to the wild, choosing to remain reclusive and elusive, her offspring had grown up with the structured boundaries of sanctuary life. Now it was time to remove those boundaries. Arthur arrived at the sanctuary that evening, a small overnight bag in hand. He would ride with the staff in the early hours, just as he had done for the first release. As the sun dipped behind the trees, he visited the enclosure one last time. Fern was resting high on a branch, her body stretched long and lean, tail twitching lazily in the breeze. Clove was beneath her, crouched in a patch of dandelions, his eyes following a moth that bobbed in the air like a piece of drifting light. When they saw him, neither came rushing over. But their ears perked, and their gaze held steady. Arthur didn't step close to the fence. Instead, he stood beneath the canopy, one hand resting gently on the oak cane Eleanor had once leaned against during her slower days. "You did good," he said softly. Both bobcats blinked. Then Clove flicked his tail once, turned, and padded away. Fern followed a moment later, graceful and sure. That night, Arthur barely slept, not because of nerves or excitement, but because of something quieter, more solemn. It felt like the closing of a circle. Dawn was pale and cool when the team gathered. Dr. Evans greeted him with a nod, Ben loading the carriers into the same white van, the Willow Creek logo freshly washed and gleaming in the early light. Fern and Clove entered their transport crates without protest. Years of careful acclimation to handling had ensured the process was smooth. But their eyes, wide and steady, gave away a quiet alertness. They knew something was different this time. The drive was long, winding through increasingly narrow roads until even cell reception gave way to pure wilderness. The park ranger leading the way drove a dusty Forest Service pickup, its headlights cutting through the morning mist like soft beams through water. When they arrived, the sun was just beginning to filter through the treetops, spilling golden light across a clearing carpeted with moss and ferns. Birds called from unseen branches, and a red fox dashed across a ridge, pausing briefly to inspect the intruders before disappearing like smoke. "This is it," Dr. Evans said. Ben and Maria, the field technician who had helped monitor the bobcats in recent months, positioned the carriers with practiced care. Arthur stood back, the soft thud of his heart echoing in his ears. The first door opened. Clove emerged cautiously, nose twitching, ears swiveling. He stepped lightly onto the grass, paused, then bounded forward with sudden decision, disappearing into the underbrush with the muscular grace of a born predator. Then Fern. She was slower, stepping out with deliberate care, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. She sniffed the wind, lowered her body slightly, then turned, not away from the forest, but toward Arthur. Their eyes met. For a moment, the world held its breath. She didn't move closer, didn't chirp. She just watched. And then, with the wind catching the fur along her spine, she turned and walked into the wild. Gone. The team was silent for several seconds after she vanished, as though waiting for some final note, some parting sound. But there was none. Arthur exhaled. "Do you think they'll find Eleanor?" he asked quietly. Dr. Evans smiled. "They don't need to find her. She's already in them." He nodded, absorbing the truth in that. And in himself, he felt a subtle settling, as if some long-carried weight had finally lowered into place. On the ride back, no one said much. But that evening, back at the sanctuary, Arthur lingered. Dr. Evans joined him by the fence where Rusty had once watched, once waited. "We never did tag him," she said. "No," Arthur replied. "He didn't need us to know where he was." She folded her arms. "I still think about him, what he became." "He became himself," Arthur said, "even if it wasn't what we expected." They stood in companionable silence, the woods beyond humming with evening life. And then, from somewhere deep in the trees, came a sound, brief, distant, unmistakable. A soft bobcat chirp. Dr. Evans turned to him. Arthur just smiled. "Some stories," he said, "don't need an ending to be complete." And in the last gold light of the day, with the wind rustling through the tall grasses and the trees swaying like gentle watchers, he knew it was true. The spot where Rusty once sat. In the waning light of an early summer evening, Arthur stood once more at the corner of Sycamore Lane. The sky above Oak Creek was painted in soft lavender and peach, and the wind carried the smell of mown grass and honeysuckle. Lawns shimmered with sprinkler mist. Porch lights flickered on one by one like stars emerging from the rooftops. The neighborhood moved gently, as it always had. Quiet laughter from a yard 2 doors down. The dull hum of a car pulling into a driveway. Someone's screen door creaking open and closed. Life continued here, in the same rhythm it always had. But for Arthur, something essential had shifted. He stepped off the sidewalk and crossed to the narrow strip of lawn near Mrs. Gable's garden. The azaleas had grown back, full and fragrant, and a few of them still bore the bend where a young bobcat had once made a habit of curling up in the sun. Arthur stood there for a while, not to search, not to hope, but simply to remember. This was the spot where he'd first seen Rusty, that impossibly small figure, ears tipped with black, fearless and out of place. He thought of the chirp, the curious stare, the soft step forward that had undone decades of careful boundaries. So much had come from that moment. Rusty had returned to the wild, fern and clove too. Eleanor, strong, whole, watchful, had rejoined the forest she'd been torn from. And Arthur, who had once defined his world by routine, had found something else, something better. He turned toward home, the cane tapping softly against the sidewalk. A few steps later, he paused and looked back, letting the silence settle around him. There was no shadow in the bushes, no movement, only the quiet chorus of the evening, the wind, the insects, the heartbeat of a neighborhood unchanged. But in the deepest part of him, in the memory of fur brushing against grass and gold eyes blinking with ancient recognition, Arthur knew. They were out there, running, hunting, living. And he who had once feared letting go now carried them with him, not as loss, but as proof. That love, given freely, leaves tracks far beyond what the eye can see. That presence, true, patient presence, can heal the deepest wounds. And that sometimes, the wild teaches us the most human truths. He stepped onto his porch, poured himself a cup of coffee still warm in the thermos. On the mantel, the 2 photographs waited, Eleanor in her sundress, laughing at something he'd long forgotten, and beside her, Eleanor the bobcat with her 3 sleeping kittens. Rusty's little body curled in the crook of her side. He raised his cup to them. To all the lives that had crossed his. To all the hearts that had stretched the shape of his own. Outside, the wind danced through the trees at the edge of the forest, and somewhere far away, beneath a canopy of stars and shadow, a bobcat blinked in the dark, and remembered, too. If this story moved something in you, stay close. Here on Paw Prints and Stories, We follow the trails of connection, healing, and quiet wildness wherever they lead.